Okay, so we're going to look at the lobes of the brain first, and then we're going to look at the cortices. Okay, so we've talked about the different parts of each lobe. Okay, so we're going to look at both the lobes and the cortices throughout this video. So we're going to start with the lobes. Okay, I've color-coded it, so hopefully it's a little bit easier to see. In this back portion back here, that's going to be called the occipital lobe. This part of the top is going to be called the parietal lobe. Down here towards the bottom, it's going to be called the temporal lobe. And then this one that kind of spans across the front of the brain is the frontal lobe. So as we look at this, we're going to come back to these names as we discuss the different parts and what they're responsible for. Okay. There is a brain stem down here that we will discuss in a different video, and then the cerebellum as well. We will discuss those two parts in a separate video. So now we're going to look at a little bit different view here. So we're going to take the same kind of idea, except we're going to look specifically at different parts of the brain. Okay, so we'll start in the occipital lobe. So keep in mind the occipital lobe is this back portion back here. So you've got two parts. You've got the primary visual cortex. I'm going to abbreviate these for the sake of keeping it on one screen. So you've got primary visual cortex, and then you've got visual association cortex. So you'll notice a common theme as we go throughout this video. You'll have a primary cortex, and you'll also have a association cortex that work together. Okay. So the primary visual cortex is, I'm going to write something at the bottom of the screen, which you can see because you have a part of your brain that's processing that you can see something. It helps you be able to see. That's the primary visual cortex. The fact that you know this letter is an A that I just drew, it's an A, and it's inside of a circle. Those things, you are able to process what you're seeing because of this visual association cortex. So think about primary visual is helping you be able to see something. It works with your optic nerve and a few other things. And then the visual association is what helps you understand what you are seeing. Okay? So if you can kind of understand that concept, the rest of this will make sense. Now, as we go into the temporal lobe, you've got a few different things. So down here at the bottom, this is what we're going to call the primary olfactory cortex. So olfaction is the ability to smell. So this is that you can sense that you smell something. Okay. There is kind of behind this, I'll just kind of color it in. Behind this yellow part, like deep within the brain, there is an association portion. You just can't really see it on this picture, okay? Now, over here, you have the primary auditory cortex, and then you have the auditory association cortex. Now, same concept, just applied to a different sense. So I can hear something because of the primary auditory cortex, okay? So once the sound goes into your ear, it gets processed through the vestibulocochlear nerve, and it comes into the brain, and your brain starts working, goes, okay, I can hear something. That's this part. The fact that you understand what you're hearing, I understand that that's a pencil tapping or a song that I know, the ability to analyze what you're hearing comes from the association cortex. Okay, so primary, picking up the sense, association, understanding and analyzing the sense. Okay, Now, we've got up here at the top. Well, actually, let's do this first. Okay, so you've got the kind of purple part in the middle. That's going to be called Wernicke's area. Okay, so we're looking specifically at this part here. It does span between the temporal and the parietal lobe, but it is responsible for language comprehension. So when someone speaks English or someone speaks a different language that you would understand, the ability or your brain in this area starts working so that you can understand what you are hearing and understand the language that's being spoken to you. Okay, up here at the top in the parietal lobe now, we've got the posterior association area. Okay, so that's going to be where they call it a multimodal cortex. So essentially, that means that the visual stuff that you see and the auditory stuff that you hear all kind of comes together in this area to be processed together. So a lot of times, multiple areas of your brain are working at the same time. So in this case, you've got auditory and visual coming together so that you can see and hear and understand kind of a general awareness of your surroundings. Okay, you'll notice a common theme in the parietal lobe because a lot of it is like that. But posterior association is visual, auditory coming together. If you go anterior to that, you've got these two lobes here. Or I'm sorry, these two cortices here. So you've got the primary somatosensory cortex, and then you've got the somatosensory association cortex. So once again, it's a common theme, primary and association cortices. So you've got the primary somatosensory is going to be what we've talked about as proprioception. Okay, proprioception is essentially your body's internal awareness of your position within space. Okay, so that basically what I'm saying is if you were to sit down like we did in class, sit down, close your eyes, and hold your hands out, you still know that your hands are out in front of you because you're having constant feedback from within your body that lets you know different things are happening. Okay, so you get hungry, your stomach growls, maybe somebody else can hear it, but you can feel it from internal. Okay, you know if you're sitting up, if you're laying down, even if your eyes are closed, you still are aware of that internal position, internal awareness, just in general. All of that comes from the primary somatosensory cortex. Being able to understand those things, so for example, something like a light vibration, like your phone goes off in your pocket, like things like that, the vibration, temperature changes, all that stuff comes from the association portion of this lobe. So primary somatosensory is picking up those sensations. Analyzing the sensations comes from the association area. Okay. Now, we're going to move to the frontal lobe. So most anterior portion is prefrontal cortex. That's going to be what we're going to call executive functions. So that includes things like learning, memory, critical thinking, decision making, all of those kind of decisions are coming from this prefrontal cortex. Next one here is going to be called Broca's area. So Broca's area is going to be the part of your brain that controls the muscles needed to produce speech. So when you go to communicate and talk, there's a lot of muscles needed to be able to have that conversation. Okay, the control of those muscles is coming from Broca's area. Okay, now at the top in this green portion, it's called frontal eye fields. So that's going to be the portion of your brain that controls the muscles that move your eyes. Okay, so you've got several muscles that move your eyes, and those muscles are controlled by this portion of your brain for voluntary eye movement. Okay, voluntary eye movement. These last two are going to be what's called primary motor cortex and the motor association cortex. So these last two at the posterior side of the frontal lobe is going to be primary motor, is being able to control the skeletal muscles. Okay, so voluntary muscle movement comes from this portion. Now, most of the time when you're completing a task, you're using a lot of muscles to do it. So the motor association is going to be how you plan and sequence the movements that you do. Okay, so in order to move the muscle, the primary motor cortex is going to be engaged. In order to plan out what movements you are doing, that's the association cortex, or the motor association cortex. Okay, so I hope that you can see that with a lot of these, there is a primary and an association cortex that work together to either perform the action or analyze the action or sequence the action. But a lot of this stuff is working together just to perform many of our everyday tasks.